Ladies and gentlemen, I think we will get started, even though we will probably have a number of people coming in. Hopefully not too much later, but this is Southern California, and it is summer, is it not? My name is Gabriel Meyer. I'm the president of the Ruskin Art Club, now in its 115th season, as one of the best kept secrets in Los Angeles. For those of you who don't know us, the club was founded in 1888 as part of the wildfire movement, I guess we could call it, of Ruskin societies springing up in America and the UK to explore the implications of critic John Ruskin's radical vision of the integration of life and art. And we're still exploring. We're delighted that you could all join us for this year's Ruskin Lecture, the inaugural event in our annual season of lectures, concerts, and symposiums. These Ruskin Lectures occupy a very special place in our life as an association. They give us a chance every year to reflect in a particularly free and open way on Ruskin's thought in the context of contemporary concerns and in terms of the questions that we're all still asking. All of which brings us to our speaker. Dave Hickey came to our attention through an article he wrote on Ruskin for Art in America. We admired the piece for its sharp and edgy focus on the power of Ruskin's inner vision, and it helped us a lot in our own discussions at that time. A lot of us were reading The Nature of Gothic at that particular point, Ruskin's famous essay in The Stones of Venice, and we found Mr. Hickey's essay helpful and broadening for all of us. So we began to conspire right away to see if we could lure him here, and as you see, we've succeeded, and he's a brave man. So we're eager to welcome him into our midst. He is a man of Ruskinian breadth, a noted cultural and art critic, a writer of fiction, a magazine editor, including a stint as the executive editor of Art in America, the owner-director of Galleries, a clean, well-lighted place in Austin, Texas, and the Reese Polly Gallery in New York City, a distinguished teacher, lecturer, and curator on both sides of the Atlantic. Last year, Mr. Hickey was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. We have several of his books on the book table in the back. Air Guitar, Essays on Art and Democracy, and Mr. Hickey's most recent book, Stardom, from Artspace Press, a collection of stories with drawings by artist John DeFazio. Mr. Hickey is presently the professor of art criticism and theory at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. Without further ado, we are honored to welcome Dave Hickey to the podium.
Thank you, Jade. It's very nice to be here. I'm going to take off my coat here. I should point out at the beginning that Ruskin, I want to talk about Ruskin and Andrea Palladio, the Renaissance architect. There are literally hundreds of points of comparison between them, since they are effectively contrapositives in the history of Western culture. What one loves, the other loathed. But in a very serious sense, they define sort of the long-term dialectic between the Mediterranean and the Northern European, between a Protestant and pagan Catholic culture, and between the North and South, as all of us who live in the South will occasionally recognize. The interesting thing as I started trying to organize this lecture is it doesn't really have a conclusion. It is a long system of sort of points, because Palladio and Ruskin are both sort of major figures in the history of architectural discourse in the West. There would be no architectural discourse without them. So since we are all already Ruskinites, I thought I would start off by talking to you a little bit about Andrea Palladio. He was born 1508 in Padua, Andrea de Pietro, and at the age of 10, he was apprenticed to a stone carver. He was a working class boy. Worked out most of his apprenticeship and then fled to Vicenza, where he began working in the famous Pedimuro workshops. He became a very excellent professional stone carver, and that's what he was. In this time, he married a woman named Legradana, who at that time was in service to the Poena family, who would later, 10 years after their marriage, actually commission a villa, complex agricultural villa from Palladio after he stopped being Andrea del Pietro and became Andrea Palladio. This transformation took place because, mostly because of the sack of Rome by Lutheran mercenaries. Rome was sacked 1534, something like that. And when Rome was sacked, this sort of signified the collapse of papal patronage. It signified the sort of collapse of that whole Roman intellectual culture in the early 16th century. It created this sort of top-tier diaspora of intellectuals and artists and painters, all of whom fled Rome, a great many of whom returned or moved to Venice and the Veneto, where Vicenza is located, the surrounding territories. And what happened at this time, along with the explosion of with the diaspora from Rome, is that because of wars on the peninsula, because of the navigation of the Cape of Good Hope, the discovery of the New World, the Venetian mercantile trade was considerably hurt at this time, and all of these Venetian aristocrats began thinking about the agricultural possibility of the lowlands, the Veneto, which surrounds Venice. And so you ended up with sort of happy circumstances if one would want to be an architect, which is you had a lot of very intelligent, intellectual people coming into the greater area of Venice, and you had a lot of building going on in the Veneto as you begin to establish some sort of agricultural world surrounding this area. Palladio, of course, was still a stone carver until he got a job while working with Pedimuro to work on the restoration of Count Giorgio Trissino's beautiful villa outside of town. Now, what Giorgio, who had been in Rome previous, friend of Isabella d'Este and Lucrezia Borgia and the whole crowd, he had been sort of forced back to Vicenza, which was his hometown. He immediately decided that he didn't like the boondocks, so he intended to open up an academy to teach the new all'antica style, the new style of architecture and learning that was flourishing in Rome at that time. So he hired Pedimuro and all of his friends to come out and transform what was a Gothic Byzantine villa into a classic Roman all'antica villa. And so on the site of this restoration, Count Trissino met Andrea de Pietro, the stone carver, and found him to be a lively and intelligent youth with a taste for mathematics and skills in building. And Trissino basically took the young stone carver as his protege with the ultimate intention of having Andrea become the first great native architect of Vicenza. In other words, this was sort of the project that evolved as they began to know each other. To understand the project that Trissino had in mind and that Palladio embraced, you have to understand at this time, Trissino, who was a sort of classic Renaissance man of letters, architectural designer, poet, he did all of these things. And he had was writing an epic poem, Terza Rima, entitled Italy Rescued from the Goths. And it was about Justinian's generals, Belisarius's two great campaigns in Italy in the late Empire to try to drive the Goths from the Italian peninsula. In the middle of this book, there is a long dream sequence. And in this dream sequence, Belisarius and his generals are taken through this imaginary palace, which is becomes an emblem of a Goth-free Italy. In other words, it is a restored classical Italy. And their guide in this tour is an angel trained in architecture, fortunately, called Palladius. And it is from the idea of Palladius, this angel who is going to restore Italy to its classical heritage, that Palladio takes his name when he becomes an architect. And of course, it is through Trissino that Palladio is taken back to Padua to the university. He goes to a party at the university, meets all these young Venetian aristocrats, 8 or 10 of them, all of whose families ultimately commissioned villas from him. One of the interesting things, as you can probably tell about Palladio, is that he was a working class kid for whom everything always worked out. He moved immediately upward. He was enormously gifted and talented architect. And he immediately became the architect of fashion in the Veneto and in Venice. Designed both urban buildings, but was most famous for these villas, which were basically farmhouses. And as such, they became the model. It's really some of the first freestanding domestic structures in the history of Renaissance architecture. There's really no precedent. There are some classical precedents, but very few Roman villas survive. And so the whole concept and design of these villas was very much Palladio's invention. He also designed a great many basilicas and palazzos and theaters and everything in urban villages. And to give you an idea of the influence of these villas, by the time Palladio died in the late 16th century, he had planned and designed 30 villas. 25 of them, construction had started on them. 17 of them survive intact today. And and these are not stone structures. These are stucco and stone, traditional Italian farm structures. And so you can understand, that is, when pieces of architecture are cared for and survive, this of course is pretty good indication of the regard with which they are held and actually continue to be held. In the process of all of his building, and I was going to say one of the classic distinctions between Ruskin and Palladio is that Ruskin really never did a day's work in his life, and from the age of 10 until the age of 70, Palladio did nothing else. He was assigned apprentice to a stone carver at the age of 10. He died on a building site at the age of 70, and never stopped in between. Produced also 15 or 16 books, the most famous of which is the Quattro Libri di Architettura, the 4 books of architecture, which were basically how-to books for building architectures, and they had the advantage at that time of the Venetian printing industry, which was at that time the source of printing in Western culture. And so these books, which described how to build not only his villas, but described how antique buildings were built, told you where to pour the rocks and how to reinforce the foundation. It was all very much of a detailed book. This book became the handbook for building in the West, period. That is, when Southern Europeans began moving north into France and into Germany, into the UK, the Quattro Libri went with them. When people started coming to the United States, what they would bring with them, of course, was Shakespeare, Caesar's commentaries, and the Quattro Libri. Those were the 3 books you brought with you to take care of things. So he became really one of the informing architects in Western civilization. Having said this, I think it's important to understand that the Quattro Libri is a how-to book. and it tells you how to do it and gives you instructions and gives you dimensions and gives you strategies. Palladio himself didn't take his own advice, which is to say Palladio's buildings are all pretty much designed by feel. If Palladio's book says there's a 17-foot ceiling and it needs to be 16.5, it's 16.5. In other words, the buildings themselves do not conform to the drawings because he worked on the site of all of his buildings. Now, as you can see, you have a situation here, those of you that have read The Stones of Venice, and I'll read you a couple of things from Ruskin, in which, in a sense, Ruskin and Palladio were engaged in parallel endeavors in the opposite direction. In other words, it was Ruskin's great goal and desire to purge the British Isles of Palladian architecture. I mean, that was his idea, and a correct idea, I think, in the sense that the English Palladians, beginning with Inigo Jones, were not Palladians of the sort that Palladio was. Palladio lived in the Republic of Venice, and he was a Republican, and he made buildings out of earth and out of stone, and he made sort of what you would call democratic buildings. Palladio was influenced by Vitruvius, who wrote his great book on architecture during the reign of Augustus. But Vitruvius, of course, wrote his book of architecture to save the idea of architecture from the last days of the Roman Republic. So that in truth, Palladio was looking back to the Roman Republic. The English Palladians were looking back to the age of Augustus. They were looking for an imperial architecture, and any of you who have traveled in the northeastern United States or in the UK will recognize that the National Gallery and the White Banqueting House at Whitehall, all these great buildings are basically what we would call imperial Palladianism. If you're interested in the Palladianism, in fact, that probably most manifests Palladio's intentions, you have to really go to Dublin, where there's a great deal of informal and elegant Palladian architecture, or you have to go to the southern United States. You have to go to Monticello or to Mount Vernon, or indeed to these places, to these wood and brick buildings which are perpetually restored. Now, of course, Palladio's task was Italy liberated from the Goths. In other words, the task of Palladio and of the generations that came before him was to rid the Italian peninsula of Gothic influence, of the influence of the medieval church, to restore some of the glory of pagan Rome, and to restore that particular culture. And I think it's important is he was, like Ruskin, he was involved in a revivalist endeavor. In other words, we're trying to Ruskin is part of the sort of Gothic revival, and in fact he is about the third generation in the Gothic revival that began with Walpole and Oliver Goldsmith, and Mary Shelley, etc., etc. Ruskin stands at the end of it, and Ruskin kind of codifies the Gothic revival. He defines the Gothic and defines its whole metaphysics for everyone. Palladio stands in the same relationship to Al Antica architecture. The first classical revival architects in Italy, principally Raphael and Bramante, who built very severe and rigorously classical buildings. They were superseded by a generation of more extravagant and expressionist architects like Michelangelo and Julio Romano. And then Palladio comes last and basically civilizes the images of the first generation, de-romanticizes the image of the second generation, and in the process he invents Italian vernacular architecture. In other words, out of Palladio comes the first real vernacular architecture. And in a sense, this was Ruskin's function, along with the arts and crafts people, was to establish a sort of domestic Gothic style, which no more existed than domestic Roman styles. In other words, they actually domesticated these sort of architectural theories. And I'd like to show you some of these villas. This is the Villa Badoer. One of the things that defines the Palladian farmhouse, of course, is its verticality. Most of this verticality is sort of important and unavoidable, since the water table in the Veneto around Venice is, not surprisingly, fairly high. The basements of these buildings have to be built above ground, since the idea of these farmhouses is that they're places to store grain. The attics are all transformed into granaries, so you have a basement, which is basically kitchens and things. Then you have this sort of temple front building, and then you have the granary, and then you have adjacent buildings. Here we have sort of your classic Palladian villas, one of the most complete villas that is designed. To understand how far Palladio is from Ruskin, this is a view of the colonnade that comes out, that leads to the outbuildings. Here is a Palladio's drawing for the building. Palladio's love of Gothic architecture was basically based on the idea that crude renditions of the grotesque and sinful flesh of animals and men could be built into these giant vertical icons of spiritual aspiration. In other words, out of human abjection and sin rise these great aspirations to spiritual. Their goals are almost entirely spiritual. The whole principle of Ruskin's reading of this architecture derives from, as he points out in The Nature of the Gothic, from the idea that the Protestant Church invented the idea of the individual soul. The idea that each man had a soul that was distinct, and women too even, and defined, that men are all the same in their bodies, in their corruption, in their sinfulness. They're all distinct in their souls. This is exactly the reverse of the Renaissance idea, which is men are all different in the irregularities of nature and character and proclivity, but the soul, being immortal, is identical. So that the idea of Palladio's architecture, Raphael's as well, and it is based on an idea of the idealization of the human body, is the body aspiring to the soul. So, like the body, Palladio's buildings are all symmetrical, left and right. They have directionality, if you please. They always aim some way, so that, as you can see here, the back of the villa is the reverse of the front of the villa. In other words, what is a porch here is an extension here. Many of them actually have arms to embrace the world that they love. They are like the body in that sense. They are also like the body in the sense that, and I'll go back one, in the sense that, well, we'll move on. I'll show you another. Via Coraro, which is actually not a farm building, but is an elegant suburban mansion built to look like a farm building. Again, in the suburbs of Venice. This is the front facade with its doubled pillars, temple fronts. There's another shot of it. It's quite wonderful, symmetrical building. Here's the interior. And actually, this interior has been tidied up to modern standards. The original interior is nearly always frescoed, has narrative, so that the outside of a Palladian villa is full of decorum. The inside is expressive and theatrical. In other words, it sort of complies to the Renaissance idea of the courtier, which is decorum without, grace within. In other words, the building itself is kind of a model of what the Renaissance hoped a person would be, which is decorum without and grace within. This is Coraro, and as you can see, the structure of the building Here you have the porch here you have the porch recessed, so that the buildings tend to be reverses of one another from front to back. Now, so that these buildings really become idealized models of the body. And they comply with models of the body in the sense that they begin with these tripartite, slightly receding sections. So you have the leg and hips, the torso, the head. In other words, in reducing structures. The whole idea of a Palladian building, the second floor is never as tall as the first floor. The granary is never as tall as the last. And also, in a great many of these buildings, laid on to this idea of the building as sort of a model of the body, is an idea of sort of cultural development, so that you begin with sort of rusticated stone at the bottom and ascend to very refined carving at the top, as if you were moving up some sort of cultural ladder. This is the Via Malcontenta, and this is actually the canal that comes out from Venice. You can actually get on a boat and ride out to it. One of the important things to notice about Palladio, because especially if you read Ruskin, because Ruskin is so brutal in his attacks on classical refinement and detail, is that in a real sense, Palladio is not really imitating classical architecture. He's sort of performing it. There are almost no classical buildings that accommodate this. Here you can see the rusticated stone on the bottom, but also what you can't see is that these columns are brick. They're brick cast in round, and the brick is left revealed. So you have what could be interpreted as a kind of modernist trope there in Palladio's buildings. The real virtue of Palladio's buildings, well, they had two, but I'll move back to the Salon at Coraro, is because Palladio was working in Venice. At the time that Palladio was working in Venice, every other European architect was putting up oiled paper or oiled leather over the windows to achieve translucency. By virtue of being in Venice in the Veneto, Palladio was the first European architect to have access to plate glass at a price that you could use it for domestic architecture. So all of these gorgeously lighted places, the impact of them on architects and on the history of architecture was absolutely stunning. Also, the thing that Palladio understood most of all, and anyone who has been in a Palladian building will understand first of all, is that he knew how big was too big, and he knew how small was too small. None of these villas are particularly grand buildings. They're all just buildings that people live in, but the scale of the rooms expands to exactly the size to make you feel bigger, but never so big to make you feel little. And I think this is the real grace of these buildings, that they are able to do that. As I say, the Palladio buildings then are always interesting from the front. They're interesting from the back. This is the reverse of Malcontenta. But as you can see, they're incredibly boring from the sides. And not necessarily, people are boring from the sides. But Palladio, recognizing this, built the Villa Rotonda, which is in fact a building with four fronts. In other words, this is in a building with identical views all the way around, as you can see. All of these buildings comply to sort of standard Renaissance design ideas. These statues are always life-size. In other words, they are there to give scale to the people in the building, so that this is how big people are. And then this little sequence here, statue, 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 is designed within a designer circle to give some unity to the house that is echoed vertically here in the rotunda. so that you have sort of classic sort of design that would come out of Raphael or any high 16th century painting designer applied to the house itself. Now, even Ruskin would admit that this is fairly well designed architecture. I will go on and show you a couple of, I think I have some of the Basilica. This is the Via Rotonda as it's designed. What you see in the center here, this white building, is the Basilica in downtown Vicenza, which is quite a beautiful building. The white structure here was Palladio's first major commission, sort of urban commission. Here is a shot of it up close. Again, a classical building, but classicism at a level of sort of refinement that you're not going to find in any classical building. This facade has 57 levels of recession in it. In other words, of objects that hit a level of recession, so that you have an enormously complex object, basically designed for the sunlight, because with that many levels of recession, the building is never the same because the shadows are changing in an amazingly intricate way. Also, this provides a pretty good explanation of why British Palladian buildings are boring, because there's no sunlight and there are no shadows, and it's just a big granite thing, like the Metropolitan Museum in New York or any of these. You know, it's like, oh, please go away. Now, one of the reasons that I wanted to come here and do this is because when I was a kid, we used to go to the Fort Worth Modern Art Club in Fort Worth, Texas, where I grew up. It was in a house just like this, and we would come and sit in chairs like those and listen to Grace Hartigan and Louise Nevelson and Willem de Kooning. And I really liked that idea, and now, of course, the Fort Worth Art Club is the Fort Worth Museum of Modern Art with a building by Ando, and where I was just there yesterday and day before. And I actually prefer the Fort Worth Art Club, to be honest. And so I thought this would be a good chance to revisit a slightly more informal and genteel cultural gathering. Anyway, against all of these elaborations of surface and symmetries, against all of this refinement and nuance, because Palladio is all nuance, Ruskin proposes the characteristics of Gothic architecture: savageness, changefulness, naturalism, grotesqueness, rigidity, redundance. In other words, he basically creates the opposite of the classical order, and in a sense, having created this, creates the opposite of the modern order. In other words, if you want to talk about the logic of what we call modernist architecture, you don't have to do much more than reverse Ruskin. And so that you have this push-pull in the history of architecture. Ruskin would describe them, say, these characters are expressed as belonging to the building, as belonging to the builder. They would be expressed thus as savageness or rudeness, love of change, love of nature, disturbed imagination, obstinacy, and generosity. And here I think is a relatively important point, is that it was in fact Northern European culture that invented the idea of the wilderness, that invented the idea of nature untouched as something of value and something of interest. The Italian peninsula has virtually no wilderness. Palladio built, cultivated structures for cultivated land. This is an entirely human environment. And so by moving into the Gothic, you move into a world where for the first time you are dealing with the wilderness and with a certain kinds of wildness and certain kinds of savagery that the whole of Mediterranean civilization spent its reign sort of looking away from, except at the Colosseum. Now, there is in both Palladio, I think, and in Ruskin, however, this sort of geographic determinism. You find this in Montesquieu. And I would like to read you this beautiful passage, which he's been talking about how we need to see the world as birds see them. And he said, let us for a moment try to raise ourselves even above the level of their flight and imagine the Mediterranean lying beneath us like an irregular lake and all of its ancient promontories sleeping in the sun, here and there an angry spot of thunder, a gray stain of cloud moving upon the burning field, here and there a fixed wreath of white volcano smoke surrounded by its circle of ashes, but for the most part a great peacefulness of light. Syria and Greece, Italy and Spain laid like pieces of golden pavement into a sea blue, chased as we stoop nearer to them with bossy beaten work of mountain chains and glowing softly with terraced gardens and flowers, heavy with frankincense, mixed among the masses of laurel and orange and plumy palm that abate with their gray-green shadows the burning of the marble rocks. Then let us pass further towards the north until we see the orient colors change gradually into a vast belt of rainy green, where the pastures of Switzerland and popular valleys of France and the dark forests of the Danube and Carpathians stretch from the mouths of the Loire and to those of the Volga, seen through clefts in gray swirls of rain cloud and flaky veils of the mist, the brooks spreading low along the pasture lines. And then further north still, we see the earth heave into mighty masses of leaden rock and heathy moor, bordering with broad waste of gloomy purple that belt of field and wood, and splintering into irregular and grisly islands amidst the northern areas, beaten by storm, chilled by ice drift, tormented by furious pulses of contending tide, until the roots of the last forest fail among the hill ravines, and the hunger of the north wind bites their peaks into barrenness, and at last the wall of ice, durable like iron, sets death-like its white teeth against us out of the polar twilight. And having once traversed in thought its gradations, the zoned iris of the earth in all its material vastness, let us go down nearer to it and watch the parallel change in the belt of animal life, the multitudes of swift and brilliant creatures that glance in air and sea or tread the sands among the southern zone, striped zebras and spotted leopards, glistening serpents and birds arrayed in purple and scarlet. Let us contrast their delicacy and brilliancy of color and swiftness of motion with the frost-cramped strength and shaggy covering of dusky plumage of the northern tribes. Contrast the Arabian horse with the Shetland, the tiger and the leopard with the wolf and the bear, the antelope with the elk, the birds of paradise with the osprey, and then submissively acknowledging the great laws by which the earth and all that it bears are ruled throughout their being, let us not condemn, but rejoice at the expression by man of his own rest in the statutes of the land given him by birth. Let us watch him with reverence as he sets side by side the burning gems and smooths with soft sculpture the jasper pillars that are to reflect a ceaseless sunshine and rise into a cloudless sky. But not with less reverence, let us stand by him then. With rough strength and hurried stroke, he smites an uncouth animation out of the rocks which he has torn from among the moss of the moorland, and heaves into the darkened air the pile of iron buttress and rugged wall, instinct with work of an imagination as wild and as wayward as the northern sea, creations of ungainly shape and rigid limb, but full of wolfish life, fierce as the winds that beat, and changeful as the clouds that shade them. this, I would point out, there is actually a section like this in the end of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you know, when Frankenstein ends up on the ice. But what, of course, Ruskin has done is, in building his elaborate justification for Gothic architecture, he has imposed a kind of geographical determinism, and it is, in fact, the same kind of determinism that Raphael, Bramante, and all of these said, let us purge Italy of Gothic architecture. It goes up north. And, you know, and then Ruskin saying, let's purge the north of Palladian architecture. It goes down south. However it goes, I think that you can see just exactly how intimately these two sensibilities are tied. They are, in fact, we're having basically two arguments about the nature of cultural identity. The restoration of the cultural identity of Northern European and culture of the British Isles, the cultural identity of the Mediterranean. And one of the amazing things, of course, is that these distinctions in color in identity have persisted and flowed across the United States. As both of us know, if I get on the airplane here in Los Angeles, if I get on the airplane in Las Vegas and fly to Rome, I haven't gone very far. I'm basically in the same Mediterranean culture I left. If I get on the plane, as I occasionally have to do, and fly to Minneapolis, I've entered an entirely new genetic universe, which is a place considerably different than we would ever imagine. Now, Ruskin grounds the defense of the Gothic, though, in a very elaborate and I think wonderful theological argument in which he says, okay, there are three kinds of ornament. There is what we call servile ornament, in which the workman replicates exactly the geometric requirements of his master. And he talks about Greek ornament and Egyptian ornament as being examples of that. Then there is constitutional ornament of the sign of the sort that you see in Palladio, which is basically presumed to be the work of an artisan class, which is not slave, but which is taught and has a wide base in society. And finally, Ruskin says, okay, but none of these are as good as revolutionary ornament, which is Christian ornament, which says everybody can make ornament, in which we are totally free. And the reason we are free is because men express their freedom in their imperfection. And this is this absolute idea that we admit that, not being gods, we are in fact imperfect, and our aspirations are imperfect. Moreover, and the most interesting of Ruskin's argument is that his real argument, and in all of this in Ruskin, as you know, comes back to the evils of industrialism. You know, he said that industrialism makes men slaves. Why does it make men slaves? Because they are bored. In other words, he cites all through the Stones of Venice, there's thousands of examples of how ennui manifests itself in architecture and how interest manifests itself. There's a beautiful description of a cloister with a set of windows in which the first window is perfect. In the second window, the guy decided to do some sort of slightly different stuff. In the third window, the whole thing has gone crazy because the guy, as he creates himself, he's amusing himself. This is an important distinction, so that you have Palladio here trying to restore some sort of classical pagan order. You have Ruskin trying to restore a sort of Protestant idea of the individual soul and of our acceptance of our imperfection. Now, excuse me. So when we look at the Stones of Venice, which is admittedly rough on Palladio because it was in fact Palladian architecture that was supplanting the great Venetian Gothic with all of its colored marbles and everything. And the Venetian Gothic was in fact Byzantine Gothic, in fact. But this suppression of the East and of the North is one of the classic examples of sort of the idea of restoring classical values. All of this, of course, is happening at the same time for Palladio with the restoration of all of this lost antiquity, most of which started when they started digging up Rome to put in St. Peter's and various sorts of Vatican things, where the guys are out digging one day and they uncover the Laocoon. And all of a sudden here's this gorgeous statue rising from the dark. Pope calls up Michelangelo, a couple of other guys, tells them to go out there and try to get hold of it. That's the general instructions. But this sort of the birth of the Renaissance has to do with the restoration of classical objects and the aspiration to restore the sort of achievement these classical objects infer. Now, and again, both Ruskin and Palladio are opposing sort of the residue of occupying cultures. If I were a president, resisting the residue of imperial cultures, I guess that would be more correct at the moment. For Ruskin, though, so what for Palladio was this gorgeous dawning, for Ruskin was the death of belief. In other words, the Stones of Venice, as those of you who have looked at it will doubtless know, is a tragedy. It is about the loss of the world of belief with the rise of commercial culture and classical learning and technology and printing and technology and glassmaking in Venice. And so, in a sense, the world that made Palladio possible is the world that Ruskin found the most daunting and depressing. Although, even Ruskin admits somewhere, and I couldn't find it in all my thing, that of all these people, Palladio was certainly the master. He was the working man that Ruskin envisioned rising from that class by the force of his personality. And so, I think what I want to conclude here, and what I want to point out, is that you have in Ruskin a sort of aesthetic formulation of how grandeur can arise from Northern European sensibilities, from particular sorts of spiritual proclivities, from an uncultivated land. With Palladio, and I think this is important, you have a serious restoration, a willful effort on the part of these people to restore to currency the language and the culture of the Italian peninsula. So as someone always asks, if you're talking about Palladio, why do you make a farmhouse look like a Roman temple? It seems fairly strange, but in fact, this is the this betrays the self-consciousness of this particular revival, because temples in Roman culture were built upon templa. And a templa is a rectangular space in which the augurer stands to prophesy the future and the past. And in particular rectangular spaces where auguries are good, they build temples. Now, and the thing is that Roman religion was never so mystified that they didn't admit that the idea of a guy standing in a square of land looking at the weather and the birds and trying to predict the future did not go back to the ancient agrarian roots of Roman culture. In other words, didn't go back to a farmer standing in his field trying to figure out whether it was going to rain or whether it was not. So in a sense, to build a farmhouse like a temple is sort of to bring this language full circle and to sort of restore, hopefully, as people say, they say that to make some connection with the cultural heritage of the place. And Palladio is doing this, and Ruskin at the same time is doing the same thing in in northern, in terms of Northern European culture. Neither of these cultures necessarily overlaps, and certainly I would be the last one to say that that manifestations of Palladian buildings in the north are ever quite successful. Alexander Pope goes to great lengths to make fun of all of the pneumonia and colds people catch in these beautiful drafty Palladian rooms, which would be lovely if they were in central Italy. But so anyway, I think that is what you can see in these two great figures, though, is the sort of manifestation of all the spiritual, aesthetic, geographical, cultural roots of various ideas about how you make art, about working in the South where we all are different in our bodily manifestation and singularly eternal and similar in our souls, of living in the North where we're all the same in our sinful bodies and individual in our souls. And out of these two sort of metaphysical constructs comes a very different world. And so anyway, that's my idea about Ruskin and Palladio. I admire them both a great deal. Could not be more different from one another. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Did I read you I didn't read you my best part. I'm sorry. I was going to read this for a conclusion. Mostly because the most pervasive relic of Ruskin's thought resides in this particular idea. Now in the make and nature of every man, however rude or simple, whom we employ in manual labor, there are some powers for better things, some tardy imagination, torpid capacity for emotion, tottering steps of thought. Those of us who teach undergraduates recognize this. There are even are there even at their worst, and in most cases, it is all our own fault that they are tardy or torpid. They cannot be strengthened unless we are content to take them in their feebleness, and unless we prize and honor them in their imperfections above the best and most perfect manual skill. This is what we have to do then with all our laborers, to look for the thoughtful part of them, to get that out of them, whatever we lose for it, whatever faults and errors we are obliged to take with it. For the best that is in them cannot manifest itself but in company with much error. Understand this clearly. You can teach a man to draw a straight line and to cut one, to strike a curved line and to carve it, and to copy and carve any number of given lines and forms with admirable speed and perfect precision. And you find this work perfect of its kind, but if you ask him to think about any of these forms, to consider it, he cannot find any better in his own hands. He stops. Execution becomes hesitating. He thinks, and 10 to 1 he thinks wrong. 10 to 1 he makes a mistake in the first touch. He gives his work as a thinking being. But you have made a man of him for all of that. He was only a machine before, an animated tool. Now, this out of Ruskin runs absolutely without alteration through the history of Western art from the mid-19th century to the present. It has terrible manifestations in the sense that it can empower the silliest and most incompetent work. It has more serious, more positive implications, is that it puts the critique to obsessive craftiness and the fetishistic rendering of objects. But as the one piece of Ruskin's dialogue, and because this is a Protestant country, this is not particularly surprising, informs all of the original defenses of abstract expressionists, of neo-expressionism, of British expressionism. All of these arise from the idea that our perfection that perfection is thoughtless. And not only that, it's true. Which is to say, any of you play the piano, read music, have you ever tried to think about what you're doing when you're doing it? You know what I mean? Try to play a piece on the piano and think about where your fingers are going. You play what we used to call cow chords. The whole principle of Sigmar Polke is a great German artist, and in this particular tradition. Sigmar's whole style of drawing is about thinking while drawing, and it generates a kind of impressive awkwardness that if he were to stop thinking and to let himself perform, would be quite elegant, but as he will tell you, and as Ruskin will tell you, it would only show you what he has been taught. And so finally out of, there's a great deal to learn from the idea, Palladio's idea of sort of harmonized grace. And there's also the great inheritance of Ruskin, especially in contemporary art, in the embrace of imperfection. So anyway, that was my ending. It didn't really have an ending, but I put that on it. Thank you. That's why I forgot it, because it wasn't really an ending. Okay. Do you have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
This brings us to what's going to happen this week about the music hall.
The Disney. Mm-hmm.
Okay, in line of that edifice, how does Ruskin and Palladio, how would they, if they were to come back, what would they say about
I think Ruskin would like it better. I do think that Frank's late work is sort of self-consciously Gothic. It has the same, as Peter Sheldall said about Bilbao, God is still in the details. It's just that it's a different God, as opposed from the modernist God. In other words, I think Frank is really sort of using technology to sort of make a kind of neo-Gothic kind of expression. I look at those and I can't help but think that that any Gothic architect would be stunned and delighted to be able to do the things that Frank can do with commissioned steel. There is a peculiarity about it, as any number of critics have pointed out, which is, of course, that these tend to be gestural extravagances built on a box. In other words, that the interiors tend to be more classical, the exteriors tend to be a little romantic, and there is real dissonance there. And in truth, I still think Palladio, even it would like Frank's buildings compared to the Getty, which aspires to be Palladian and makes about every mistake you can make to not be Palladian. If you've ever walked through the Getty and you know those big, first of all, Palladio knows that unfinished travertine turns yellow. I mean, all you have to do is walk through Rome to see a lot of yellow travertine. Soon we're going to have a big lemon up on top of that hill. This bright yellow thing. But if to understand the intelligence of Palladio's construction, look at those big walls of ascending travertine in perfect grids. So the bottom one and the top one are the same size. That's why they appear to be falling on top of you. You see, in a Palladian sequence, as you rise, the intervals become smaller. Gives the illusion of the walls standing vertical. When the intervals are identical, the wall looks like it's coming over there. So I think if I haven't heard the Disney, I'm sure though, having looked at the plans, that it sounds pretty good, since sound hates parallel walls, and Frank has never been known for doing those. I actually haven't given it much thought. There's a peculiar thing about Gary's recent architecture, and I think it's the reason that it has achieved so much acclaim, which is that art is fast and cheap, and architecture is slow and expensive. So the sort of intellectual atmosphere out of which Gary's new buildings come is 1974. In other words, it comes out of Miles Davis, it comes out of Badoer, when it comes out of Richard Serra, a great deal of sort of hard expressive materials art, but it took the intervening time for us to get custom steel. In other words, so that you could order any piece of steel to go anywhere you want to exactly. And so this gives us we have this wonderful, I guess what architects always want, is that when you see a Gary, you say, oh, that's great, I've always wanted that since '74, but oh, it's brand new. So you get something that's at once new and nostalgic, and that doesn't hurt. I think the buildings are variously successful. The buildings in Cleveland and Minneapolis, I think, are somewhat less persuasive. But I think the Disney's is kind of a lovely building, especially when you compare it to the Getty. At least that's just my opinion. I've known Frank since I was 25, so I don't, you know, yes. I think it's very nice. I think Maneo's a good architect, and he has, again, he's a good old-time, straight-ahead, don't make any mistakes architect, and he's also very good at interiors. You know, that is, a Maneo interior is about 5 times as good as a Gary interior, and 100 times as good as a Meyer interior, I think. They make charming spaces, and I mean, sometimes they're boring. The museum in Houston is boring, but the cathedral here is, I think, quite nice. I don't know if it makes sense to build anything permanent in Los Angeles, however. You know, or in Las Vegas, and because you think, wow, can't we move that? What I'm saying, the reason I was thinking that is I got a call from the Los Angeles Times that wanted me to write an op-ed piece about whether the Disney Hall would become the icon of Los Angeles, you know. And no, you know, icon of Los Angeles is a taco stand, you know, or, you know, but what I'm saying is that this city has plenty of iconography without the Disney Hall. And also any city that worries about whether it has an image or not should not be worrying about that, I think. But, I do think the cathedral's quite lovely, and you know, Maneo's not noisy, and nor is he ever noisy. And sometimes that means they're boring, as the museum in Houston is, but never offensively so, I don't think. You know, it's like a nice, comfortable uncle kind of architect, and we need that, I think. Anybody else? Great. Now there will be snacks. Thank you so much.